Welcome to another episode of Chasing the Wind. I'm Pastor Mark. Hey, I want to talk to you today about finding your own story. Okay, finding your own story. The Lord speaks to me through movies. And I love quotes from movies and whatnot. But anyway, there's a movie that my wife and I watched here a couple months ago called Finding Forrester. Not necessarily a newer movie, but it's 10, 15 years old. Something named Sean Connery is in it. Anyway, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author who's kind of a recluse now. But anyway, he befriends this young man and who's got incredible talent and wants to help him. He's trying to help him learn how to write and to be a good writer. And at one point, the main character comes out of his reclusiveness to read this young man's paper, who is now in trouble because he supposedly plagiarized the Pulitzer Prize winning author's work. But as he writes it, and this teacher is going to be holding this young man accountable, he lauds all over the Pulitzer Prize winning author about how great it is, and your words have so much. And he says to him, well, there's just one thing you need to understand. Those aren't my words. He goes, those are this young man's words. Jamal is his name. Those are his words. And the teacher's like, his words? And he goes, yeah. He goes, I let him use some of my words from one of my books to get him started. And once he got started typing my words, his own words started to flow. And that came to my mind the other day as I think about mentoring and discipling and kind of spiritual coaching people. Sometimes what we need to do is let people borrow our faith. We need to let them borrow even maybe a little bit of our story so that they can find their own story. And as I was thinking about this, Andrew and I were talking about it, we thought of when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Sometimes we imitate others, okay, and imitation is not always a bad thing. It's flattery in some ways. When someone wants to be like me, I had a little guy at my church one time. On Easter I usually wore bow ties, and he wore a bow tie that day. He wanted to be like Pastor Mark. My wife told me about my nephew who always wore a suit on Sunday, like his dad. His dad was the worship minister of music, and his dad always wore suits, and so he wanted to wear suits too. It's a beautiful thing, and sometimes that's not all bad. We're borrowing what we need to do. We don't always know what to do, so we learn from other people, and sometimes we need a little help getting started. And so that's okay. That's okay. How many of us have ever gotten something from someone, a tool or something like that? My dad has given me stuff, not that I know how to use those tools, by the way, but it's like I need it. He goes, here, take this with you. You might need it someday. I'm like, what is that? And he goes, oh, you'll figure it out when you need it. When San and I got married almost 32 years ago, I remember I was over at this couple's house calling on them at the first assignment I was in, and actually I was on my field training. I hadn't even I stayed there as my first assignment as an associate pastor, but the pastor and I went over and called on this wonderful couple, and Jess and Marguerite was her name, and they had a beautiful Duncan Fife drop leaf table, and she started to talk about how they were going to get rid of that table and sell it because they just didn't use it anymore. And she was telling me stories about how all the people from the church that had ever sat around that table and been to their house, and I'm a little bit of a sentimental old fool sometimes like that, and I just got really, I wasn't old at the time, by the way. Now I'm a sentimental old fool. Then I was just sentimental. And I thought, well, Sandy and I don't have a dining room table. I said, well, what do you want for that table? And she goes, oh, $50. Well, boom, I was on that. And it wasn't that it was an antique. I love antiques, but it was that there was a history with it. Of people sat there, and that was one of those things that we got, and they were tickled that we got it because it was something that it was like that starting with someone else's stories, because for us it was how many stories were around that table, and then there's been more stories around that table that we've had, and Sandy and I are possibly in the process of, we might be handing that down to another young couple getting married here in the next year. And sometimes it's our faith sharing our faith story with someone else that gets them started on their own faith story. I think that's one of the reasons it's so important for us to share our faith and to live our lives in such a way that someone says, I want to be like them. That's how it is down here with me and with Andy. I mean, I just want to be like Andy. He's so perfect. You can hear him laughing in the background. And but I hope that someday someone would look at me and say, man, I want to be a pastor like Pastor Mark. And all the good stuff, hopefully, not the bad stuff. I've had my issues with Pastor. We all make our mistakes. But I told someone the other day, I said, I need to go back to my first churches and ask for forgiveness. But, they were very gracious with me. And we learned from each other. And it's not always, there was something I heard years ago. Christianity is more caught than taught. We can tell people about Christ, but when they hear our story, that's a piece where they start. And Andy and I were talking about the idea of like sourdough bread. You get sourdough bread started, and what do? You get some and you give it to someone else because it starts going. And Andy was talking about chili starter packets. Now, I don't use that because I'm a professional chili maker. I don't use starter packs. I know how to do it. But I understand for some amateurs, they got to have a starter pack. And yes, the Lord will deal with me on my pride here shortly. But anyway, sometimes you need a little something to help get something going, don't you? That's what yeast does. A little bit of yeast goes throughout the whole thing, and it makes it better. And so, I just want to encourage you a little bit today, wind chasers, to let someone use a little bit of your story because you shared it with them, that they say, this is how my story began, is because someone shared their story with me, their words, their faith journey that helped me discover what my faith journey was. And I'm going to tell you something, folks, that's a beautiful thing. That's just a beautiful thing. So I'm going to leave it right there with you, wind chasers. Keep sharing your story and keep chasing the wind, because the wind is chasing you. The Holy Spirit is chasing you. Till next time, I'm Pastor Martin. Grace and peace.